They said he was a man of retinea 3 times a day, without fail. At dawn, when the world was still half asleep and the air smelled of dust and dew, you could see him riding out toward the ridge beyond Dry Creek. At noon, when the sun sat high and cruel, he'd be there again, hat tilted low, the light cutting hard across his weathered face. And at dusk, when the sky turned to fire and shadows stretched long, he'd make his final trip, slow and steady, like a man walking into yesterday. Nobody in Calico County knew why. Some said he'd lost his wife up there. Others swore it was where he buried gold from a forgotten war. The children whispered that he spoke to ghosts, so that every ride was a conversation with the dead. But those who knew him best, or thought they did, said one thing for sure: he never missed a ride. Not for storm, nor sickness, nor sorrow. His name was Thomas Avery, though most folks called him 3 times Tom. He wasn't much for talk, not since the fire that took his ranch 15 years back. He rebuilt, quiet and alone, piece by piece, like a man atoning for something no one dared ask about. His hands were always rough with work, but his eyes pale gray like creekstania carried a kind of silence that could make a man forget his words. Every morning, the sound of his horse, Old Boone, echoed through the valley before the sun even cleared the canyon rim. Folks at the general store could set their clocks by him. At first, people thought it was a kind of madness, a grief-turn ritual. But after a while, it became part of the landscape itself, like the windmill blade spinning or the train whistle from the far-off line. One morning, a boy named Eli, son of the blacksmith, got curious enough to follow him. He waited until Tom passed the barn road, then kept low, weaving through the sagebrush, careful not to spook Boone. The trail wound up a steep rise, sharp rocks cutting through the dirt, until it flattened out into a clearing that looked down over miles of open land. That's when Eli saw the 3 wooden crosses, standing crooked in the hard soil. Tom dismounted, slow and deliberate. He didn't pray or cry. He just stood there, hat in hand, looking at those crosses as if measuring the years between then and now. Eli couldn't hear what he said, but he saw the man's lips move. He had just a few words, whispered low, carried away by the wind. Then Tom kneeled, brushing dust from the base of the first cross. For a long time, he stayed like that, motionless, until Boone snorted softly, breaking the silence. Eli slipped back down the trail, heart pounding. When he told his father what he'd seen, the blacksmith just frowned. "Don't ever follow that man again, you hear? Some things ain't meant to be looked at." But the boy couldn't stop thinking about it. Why 3 graves? Who rested there? And why visit them 3 times every day? By the time Tom rode back into town for supplies, whispers were already circling like vultures. Someone claimed the crosses marked his wife and sons, taken by bandits. Another swore he'd buried the outlaws themselves, one by one, as revenge. But the sheriff, an old friend from Tom's cavalry days, said something different, something that chilled folks more than any ghost tale. "Those ain't graves," he said one evening at the saloon, "they're reminders. Tom don't visit the dead, he visits what he did." No one dared ask him what that meant. As days rolled by, Tom's ritual never broke. Rain would soak him to the bone, wind would tear across the ridge, yet he'd still ride. Sometimes he'd bring a bundle of small things wrapped in cloth and bury them near the crosses. Nobody knew what was inside. Some said it was letters. Others thought they were pieces of his pasta keepsakes, tokens, sins. One summer evening, lightning danced across the plains like fire in the sky. The ridge glowed orange from the strikes, and thunder rolled low and mean. Folks thought surely Tom would stay in that night, but sure enough, they saw the lantern bobbing along the trail, slow and steady, making its way through the storm. Old Martha, who ran the boarding house, watched from her porch and muttered, "He's talking to God tonight." The next morning, the air smelled of burnt grass. When Tom returned, his coat was singed, and his face looked carved from stone. The ridge had taken another secret from him, but no one dared ask which. For years, life went on that way: 3 rides, 9 stops, 3 prayers or confessions, depending who you asked. The pattern became so unshakable that the land itself seemed to move in rhythm with him. Then one day, the pattern broke. It was late autumn when a letter arrived in town addressed to Thomas Avery, marked from Washington, D.C. The postmaster said it bore a seal from the War Department. Tom took it without a word, rode off, and that evening, folks saw smoke rising from his chimney for the first time in months. They say that letter was what started everything that came after the stranger, the graves, and the truth that would echo far beyond Calico County. But in that moment, all anyone knew was that something had shifted. That night, Tom rode out again, but this time, it wasn't at dawn, noon, or dusk. It was midnight, and when he didn't come back until sunrise, folks said the man who returned wasn't quite the same. His eyes, once cold, now burned with purpose. Whatever he'd been waiting for, it had come. The next morning, a lion, now a grown Mona, saw him ride past the blacksmith's again, the same slow gait, the same steady stare. But there was something different in the air, something heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. Tom didn't just ride toward the ridge that day. He rode toward history, and though no one knew it yet, what he was about to do would turn the quiet legend of 3 times Tom into the story that changed the West forever. By the time autumn winds began whispering across the plains, folks had grown used of the sight of Thomas Avery's shadow riding toward the ridge. But something had changed in the man's rhythm since that letter arrived from Washington. His rides were no longer slow and steady, they were sharp, driven, like a man racing against time. He spoke to no one, not even the sheriff, and those who met his eyes said they saw a fire that hadn't burned there in decades. Word of him reached beyond Calico County, carried by traveling traders and railroad men. It was in one of those dim-lit saloons in Tucson that a man named Silas Cade heard the story. Cade wasn't a preacher or a lawman. He was a former journalist, a sharp-eyed, smooth-talking, and always sniffing for the kind of story that could buy him redemption or ruin. When someone told him about 3 times Tom, the rancher who rode the same ridge 3 times a day for 15 years, Cade smirked and said, "That ain't habit, that's guilt." So he came riding north, chasing a legend. When he reached Calico County, it was the kind of town that looked half asleep even at high noon. Dust clung to everything: boots, signs, even the air itself. The sheriff gave him a squint and a warning: "You don't go digging where Tom Avery walks." Some stories ain't meant for ink, but Cade had chased lies longer than he'd believed in truth. He thanked the sheriff and rented a horse anyway. That evening, as the sun fell low and gold light spilled across the valley, Cade spotted him, Thomas Avery, riding out toward the ridge. Same path, same horse, same silence. Cade followed at a distance, careful to stay downwind. The sound of hooves muffled by sand. The trail curved past a dry creek bed, climbed through brittle brush, and finally opened to that haunted clearing where 3 wooden crosses stood against the sky. Tom dismounted and stood still, hat in hand. From where Cade crouched behind a boulder, he could see the man's lips moving. No sound, just faint gestures, like someone reciting something old and heavy. Then Tom reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, and set it down before the middle cross. He lingered a moment, then mounted Boone and rode back toward town without looking back once. When the sound of hooves faded, Cade rose. The air up there felt different, thin and watchful, like the ridge itself knew he didn't belong. He knelt by the middle cross and saw the paper, damp with evening dew. It wasn't a prayer, it was a letter. The ink had faded, but he could still make out a name at the bottom: Captain Thomas Avery, 7th Cavalry Regiment. His breath caught. The rest of the words spoke of orders, sealed missions, and something that made his stomach twist: Operation Black Creek, 1868. Bury the evidence. Cade stuffed the letter into his coat just as thunder rolled from the distance. He knew the name Black Creek. It was a massacre, one buried deep in the official reports, a supposed bandit raid that left the village burned and 24 dead. The story never made papers because the army had claimed it was classified. But if Tom Avery had been there, if he'd been the one who'd done the burying, those 3 crosses weren't graves. They were confessions. By the time Cade returned to town, night had swallowed the sky. The saloon lanterns flickered weakly, and the air buzzed with the scent of whiskey and secrets. He ordered a drink but never touched it, just stared into the glass, piecing the puzzle together. Why had the War Department written to Tom after all these years? What had they found or feared he might tell? He didn't have to wait long to find out. Near midnight, as the wind howled through town, Tom burst through the saloon doors. The chatter died in an instant. He looked older, harder, like the night itself had carved new lines into his face. His eyes locked on Cade. "You followed me," Tom said, voice low, carrying the kind of calm that made men nervous. Cade didn't deny it. "I had to. You've been keeping the truth buried up there, and folks deserve to know what you did." Tom stepped closer, boots heavy on the wooden floor. "You think truth is something you dig up and show around? You think that'll fix it?" Cade straightened. "It won't fix it, but it'll make it right." The room stayed silent, every man frozen between fear and curiosity. Finally, Tom turned, heading for the door. "Meet me at the ridge tomorrow, sunrise. You want your trotty, you'll get it, but you best understand a broken bar once you see it. You can't unsee it." The next morning, the ridge was quiet except for the low moan of the wind. Cade was there first, the stolen letter tucked in his coat, his notebook ready. When Tom arrived, he looked like he hadn't slept. He carried the spade in a rusted tin box. He set it down between the crosses. "You ever wonder why a man keeps coming back to the same spot, day after day?" he asked. Cade said nothing. Tom sighed. "I wasn't mourning, I was guarding. That ridge ain't holy ground, it's a lie built on one." He began to dig, the earth dry and stubborn. The deeper he went, the darker the soil became. After a few minutes, the spade hit a small chest, bound with iron. He pried it open, and the smell of time poured out. Inside were papers, photographs, and a small locket. The papers were orders to signed, sealed, stamped by the United States Army. Cade picked one up, eyes wide. "You were sent to destroy evidence." Tom nodded. "I was told to clear the land or burn it clean. They said we were hunting bandits. Turned out it was a village of families, not fighters. When I saw what we'd done, I buried the proof myself. The other men called it loyalty. I called it shame." He pulled out the locket, opened it. Inside was a small portrait of a woman and 2 children. "They gave this to me before we fired. Said if I had a heart, I'd keep it safe. So I did, and I've come here 3 times a day ever since yet to remind myself what the word day duty cost." Cade stood silent, the notebook limp in his hand. The truth was heavier than he imagined, and not the heroic legend he'd come for, but the wound that never healed. Then Tom looked at him, eyes fierce. "The War Department wrote to me because they want this buried again. They're coming. They don't want the story, they want silence." Cade's pulse raced. "Then we print it. We send it east. We make them answer for it." Tom shook his head. "I'm done fighting. My part ends here." He handed Cade the tin box. "Yours starts now." For a long time, neither man spoke. The wind carried the sound of distant thunder again, same as the night before. Then Tom turned, climbed onto Boone, and rode off without another word. By the time Cade looked up from the documents, the ridge was empty. The legend of 3 times Tom had become something else entirely. A man's penance turned into a country's reckoning. And somewhere between those 3 crosses and the rising sun, the truth began to take shape, the kind that could no longer be buried.